You are ready to tell everybody, and nobody needs to pressure you, nobody needs to force you. You freely admit whatever it is. Yeah, maybe you might be a criminal and you might freely admit your crimes, but that's rare. That is rare. Criminals usually hide their crimes and keep them in secret. But you might freely admit to something else. Yeah, you might freely admit to usually you freely admit to something that you are not ashamed of. And that's the point. When you freely admit to something, you're not ashamed of it. It's not something that you consider a sin or a crime. So yeah, you might freely admit to whatever. If you readily admit something, then you admit it very quickly, very easily. Nobody has to force you. So I'd say those two are very similar. And even openly admit, they're all very similar. They mean that you're not reluctant to admit something. You are not reluctant. When you are reluctant, you don't want to admit it. You're not ready to admit it. But freely admit, readily admit, openly admit means you are willing. You are very willing to admit something. Now, the opposite of freely admit, readily admit, openly admit would be reluctant to admit, be embarrassed to admit, be ashamed to admit, and even this one, be loath to admit. It's a good word, this one, loath. Be loath to admit is a synonym of be reluctant to admit. It's exactly the same thing. So he is loath to admit his mistakes. And of course, many humans are loath to admit their mistakes. And it's not good. We should all be willing to admit our mistakes. We should all freely admit our mistakes, readily admit our mistakes, openly admit our mistakes, so that we can correct those mistakes.